I need to check the framework document carefully before writing. The title is The Real Reason Trump is Hitting Canada with 100% Tariffs Over China, 274K Views. Let me craft a complete script following all specifications. There is something deeply strange happening in American trade policy right now, and almost nobody is talking about the real reason behind it. President Trump has just slapped Canada, America's closest ally, its largest trading partner, and the country that shares the longest undefended border in the world, with tariffs that in some sectors reach a staggering 100%. Meanwhile, China, the country Trump himself has called America's greatest economic adversary for the better part of a decade, faces comparatively lighter treatment. On the surface, this makes absolutely no sense. Why would any American president punish the neighbor who buys more American goods than any other country on earth while going softer on the nation he's accused of stealing American jobs, manipulating its currency, and hollowing out the industrial heartland? That is the question this video is going to answer. And when you see the actual dynamics at play, the leverage calculations, the personal politics, and the strategic miscalculations driving this extraordinary decision, you'll understand that this isn't really about trade at all. It's about something far more revealing about how this administration actually operates and what it means for every alliance America has left. Let's start with the numbers, because they tell a story the White House would rather you didn't hear. Canada and the United States conduct roughly $700 billion in bilateral trade annually. That makes Canada not merely a significant partner, but the single most important trading relationship America has. Approximately 3/4 of Canadian exports flow south into the United States, which means Canada is profoundly dependent on American market access. Now, on the surface, that dependency looks like leverage for the American side. And indeed, that is precisely how the Trump administration has framed this, as a negotiation from strength, applying maximum pressure to extract concessions on everything from dairy quotas to energy pricing to immigration enforcement along the northern border. But here's what that framing conveniently ignores. The integration between the Canadian and American economies isn't a one-way street. American manufacturers depend on Canadian raw materials, Canadian energy, and Canadian intermediate goods at virtually every stage of production. The auto industry alone sees parts crossing the border multiple times before a single vehicle rolls off the assembly line. When you impose 100% tariffs on Canadian goods, you aren't simply punishing Canada, you are driving up costs for American manufacturers, American consumers, and American exporters who rely on Canadian inputs to remain competitive globally. Now compare this with the China situation, and the contrast becomes genuinely remarkable. The Trump administration entered office promising to be tougher on China than any previous administration. The rhetoric was extraordinary: economic enemy, currency manipulator, the great threat to American prosperity. And yet, when you examine the actual tariff structures that have emerged, something doesn't add up. The effective tariff rates on many Chinese goods, whilst substantial, fall well below what's been imposed on Canada in key sectors. The administration has granted numerous exemptions, delayed implementation timelines, and quietly carved out exceptions for industries where American companies have told the White House, in no uncertain terms, that Chinese supply chains cannot be replaced overnight. So what's really going on here? Why is Canada bearing the brunt of a trade war that was supposed to be aimed at Beijing? The first and perhaps most important part of the answer involves something the administration will never publicly admit. Leverage dynamics work both ways, and China has leverage that Canada simply doesn't possess. When Trump threatened China with escalating tariffs, Beijing responded with something the White House clearly didn't anticipate. China controls processing and refining of approximately 60 to 70% of the world's critical minerals and rare earth elements. These are materials essential to everything from smartphones to military aircraft to the electric vehicle batteries that even traditional automakers are now racing to produce. When Beijing signaled willingness to restrict rare earth exports in retaliation, the calculus in Washington changed overnight. There is a specific internal dynamic here that becomes clear when you look at which exemptions were granted and which industries received quiet assurances. American technology firms, defense contractors, and pharmaceutical companies, industries with enormous lobbying power and deep connections to both parties, made it abundantly clear that aggressive action against China would devastate their supply chains in ways that couldn't be remedied for years, possibly decades. And the administration listened, not publicly, of course. Publicly, the rhetoric remained fierce, but the actual policy implementation tells a very different story from the speeches. Canada, by contrast, has no such retaliatory capability. Canada cannot threaten to cut off materials essential to American national security. Canada cannot restrict access to a manufacturing base that American industry depends upon for its most advanced products. Canada can impose counter tariffs on American goods entering the Canadian market, and indeed has done so, but with a population roughly 1/9 the size of the United States, the retaliatory impact is asymmetric by definition. Put simply, Trump is hitting Canada harder because Canada can't hit back hard enough to make it genuinely painful. This isn't strategic brilliance. This is a schoolyard calculation. Go after the one who can't fight back while finding reasons to accommodate the one who can. Now, you might be thinking that there must be more to it than pure leverage calculation, and you'd be right. The second factor driving this extraordinary asymmetry involves domestic politics in a way that reveals something deeply uncomfortable about how trade policy is actually made in this administration. Consider the political geography for a moment. Canada's retaliatory tariffs have been specifically designed to target American exports from states that voted for Trump. Canadian officials, to their credit, have been remarkably sophisticated about this. They've targeted bourbon from Kentucky, dairy products from Wisconsin, steel from Pennsylvania, all swing states or states with significant Republican representation. The rational response to this targeted retaliation would be to recognize the political cost and moderate the approach. Instead, the administration has escalated, and the reason becomes apparent when you understand that for this White House, the appearance of toughness matters more than the economic outcome. Let's examine what former Canadian Ambassador David McNaughton told the Financial Times about the negotiating dynamic. He described the American approach as fundamentally performative, designed to generate headlines about toughness rather than to achieve specific economic objectives. And this observation cuts to the heart of the matter. The tariffs on Canada aren't primarily an economic strategy. They're a domestic political strategy dressed up in economic language. Compare this with how the administration has handled China. When Beijing pushes back, the administration finds face-saving compromises, announces grand deals that upon inspection contain remarkably few concrete changes, and declares victory while quietly walking back the most aggressive positions. When Canada pushes back, the administration doubles down, because admitting that a country 1/9 your size forced you to reconsider doesn't play well on Fox News. Whereas claiming you're being tough on a neighbor that most Americans vaguely associate with politeness and hockey carries almost no political cost. There's a third dimension here that deserves careful examination, and it's perhaps the most troubling of all. The timing of these Canadian tariff escalations has consistently coincided with moments when the administration needed to divert attention from difficulties on other fronts. When the China trade talks stalled in ways that couldn't be spun as progress, pressure on Canada intensified. When economic indicators suggested the tariff regime was beginning to damage domestic manufacturing, a new round of Canadian measures was announced with sufficient fanfare to dominate the news cycle. When diplomatic setbacks in other arenas embarrassed the administration, Canada provided a convenient target for demonstrating resolve. This pattern isn't speculation. Track the dates of major Canadian tariff announcements against the broader news cycle, and the correlation is genuinely striking. Canada has become, in effect, a pressure release valve for an administration that needs constant evidence of toughness, but has discovered that genuine toughness against adversaries who can retaliate comes with consequences they'd rather not face. Now, what does Canada's actual response tell us about how this is being perceived internationally? Because here is where the broader implications become truly significant. Canada has not simply accepted this treatment. Prime Minister Carney has explicitly linked trade policy to questions of national sovereignty. Canadian businesses have accelerated diversification away from American market dependency, and public opinion polling shows Canadian attitudes toward the United States have shifted dramatically. A country that has historically been America's most reliable ally, most integrated economic partner, and closest cultural cousin, is now actively pursuing reduced dependence on the American market. And Canada isn't alone in drawing conclusions from this spectacle. European allies watching America treat its closest partner this way have accelerated their own strategic autonomy discussions. Japan, South Korea, and Australia, all countries that depend on American alliance commitments, are quietly asking themselves whether partnership with this version of America represents a strategic asset or a strategic liability. As we'll see when we look at the economic evidence, the damage isn't theoretical, it's already measurable and accelerating. The economic data emerging from the first months of these intensified tariffs tells a story that should alarm anyone paying attention. Cross-border investment between Canada and the United States, which had been growing steadily for decades, has contracted. American companies that maintained Canadian operations are reviewing those commitments. Canadian pension funds, which represent some of the largest institutional investors in American infrastructure, have signaled reconsideration of future commitments. The Bank of Canada has identified the tariff uncertainty as a material risk to economic stability, and American border communities, towns and cities whose economies depend on cross-border commerce, are reporting measurable economic contraction. Meanwhile, and this is the part that makes the strategic incoherence truly apparent, China has used the period during which American attention focused on Canada to strengthen its own trade relationships across Southeast Asia, deepen economic ties with European nations uncertain about American reliability, and accelerate development of alternative financial systems designed to reduce global dependence on the American dollar. Every month that Washington spends fighting with Ottawa is a month Beijing spends building the economic architecture of a post-American trade order. The irony is almost too perfect to be accidental, though one suspects it genuinely is, because the alternative, that the administration understands this dynamic and pursues the strategy regardless, would require a level of strategic incompetence that beggars even the most cynical assessment. The historical parallel that illuminates this moment most clearly isn't from trade policy at all. It's from the declining years of British imperial power, when London repeatedly found itself applying maximum pressure to dominions and smaller partners who posed no genuine threat, while accommodating rising powers whose challenge actually mattered. The psychology is remarkably consistent across centuries. Declining powers find it easier to bully friends than confront adversaries, because bullying friends carries lower immediate risk, even as it systematically destroys the alliance structures that sustain power over longer horizons. What nobody in the administration appears to grasp, or perhaps they grasp it and simply don't care, is that alliances aren't merely nice to have. They are force multipliers that allow nations to project influence far beyond what their individual capabilities would permit. Every country that reduces its dependency on America, every ally that pursues strategic autonomy, every partner that hedges by deepening ties with Beijing reduces the total weight of American influence in global affairs. And that reduction is not reversible through tweets or tariff threats once it's occurred. Supply chains, once redirected, don't snap back. Trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild on a presidential election cycle. Institutional relationships, once degraded, require decades to restore. So, what are the likely consequences if this trajectory continues? First, expect Canadian economic diversification to accelerate dramatically. The political consensus in Canada has shifted from viewing trade diversification as desirable to viewing it as existentially necessary. Trade agreements with the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Pacific nations will receive investment and attention that previously flowed toward managing the American relationship. Within 5 years, Canada's trade dependency on the United States, currently around 75% of exports, could decline meaningfully. Not because Canada wants this, but because a country that has watched its largest partner weaponize trade for domestic political purposes would be foolish not to build alternatives. Second, the precedent being established extends well beyond Canada. Every American ally is now calculating whether their own partnership might be sacrificed for a domestic news cycle. NATO members are investing in European defense capabilities not because they've suddenly discovered martial spirit, but because the reliability of American commitments has become a genuine strategic question rather than a theoretical one. Indo-Pacific partners are engaging with Chinese economic initiatives they previously resisted, not because they prefer Beijing to Washington, but because hedging against American unreliability has become basic strategic prudence. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the economic cost to the United States itself will compound over time in ways that aren't immediately visible in quarterly data. When Canadian energy, Canadian lumber, Canadian minerals, and Canadian manufactured components become more expensive through tariff walls, those costs permeate the entire American economy. Housing becomes more expensive, manufacturing inputs become more costly. Energy security diminishes as Canadian resources are redirected toward markets that treat their suppliers as partners rather than subordinates. Bringing all of this together, what we're witnessing isn't simply a trade dispute. It's a case study in how great powers accelerate their own decline through precisely the kind of behavior that feels powerful in the moment but proves catastrophic over time. Trump is hitting Canada with 100% tariffs not because Canada is America's enemy, not because it serves any coherent economic strategy, and certainly not because it advances American interests in the competition with China. He's doing it because Canada is the one target that can't hit back hard enough to make the headlines uncomfortable, because domestic audiences respond to the appearance of toughness, regardless of whether that toughness is directed at the right target, and because this administration has consistently confused the ability to inflict damage with the possession of strategic advantage. The real story here isn't about tariffs at all. It's about an America that has become so consumed with performing strength that it's systematically dismantling the relationships that actually made it strong. China watches this unfold with something that must approximate satisfaction, because every bridge Washington burns with Ottawa, every alliance it strains with Brussels, every partnership it degrades with Tokyo is a bridge Beijing doesn't need to burn itself. When historians look back at this period, they won't focus on the specific tariff rates or the particular trade disputes. They'll focus on the moment when the world's most powerful nation began treating its closest friends as enemies and its actual competitors as problems too difficult to confront. And they'll note, with the clarity that hindsight provides, that by the time anyone in Washington understood what had been lost, it was already far too late to get it back. Such is the way of things. The consequences won't arrive with fanfare or announcement. They'll arrive slowly, invisibly, in trade deals signed without American participation, in supply chains rerouted around American tariff walls, in alliance meetings where Washington's seat at the table quietly becomes less central than it used to be. And when those consequences finally become impossible to ignore, the architects of this extraordinary strategic blunder will, as always, profess complete astonishment that anyone could have seen it coming.